All right, it is Friday, time for API storytelling time. I'm gonna bring in Aiden here to help me kick things off. Here you are. Hey,
Doing
good. Busy week. How about you?
same here, but again, this is like the nice way to roll into the weekend. So super excited about our guest today.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about him too. So for everybody, we don't have Mike Amundsen with us today, but we do have a guest. And I'll let you intro our guest today, Aiden. Go ahead.
So this is perfect for API storytelling. This person is a self-described socio-technical system designer, bringing in the technology and the people side of things. Common attendee of all the API conferences. I got to watch a few of his things over the weekend. I had a great time doing that. And really excited to introduce everyone to Matthew Reinbold, also known as Libel Vox on Twitter.
All right, let's bring him in. There we are. Welcome.
Hey, great to be here. I have successfully traveled through the interwebs to be here, this nebulous space with you. Yay!
You look really familiar to me. It seems like I've known you from somewhere. I haven't having trouble placing it, but it seems like maybe you. Oh yeah, I remember you. You host a show called Between Two Ferns, I think, and I may have seen you on that one, but just not sure. It could be. Maybe I'm mistaken.
That was a great time, and I truly wish we were able to continue that series. I thought we had a great conversation, and for those that are interested in finding out that backstory, you can still find it on YouTube if you search for my name and Kin's name, and it'll come up in your search results. But it was a great conversation, and unfortunately, that wasn't my job at the time. It was just something fun that we were able to do.
Hey, the
Well, I
best
enjoyed it.
of these like creative things that aren't part of our job. Like that's where all the good stuff comes from.
Right. Well, and I've always had a very hard time doing just one thing. I've always enjoyed doing a little bit of the developer evangelism and a little bit of the business side and a little bit of the strategery and all of that stuff. And then you mix it in a big vat and out comes me. And it can be difficult sometimes when people just want a product manager, people just want an engineer, some people just want an architect. But it does mean that we get to do fun stuff occasionally when you have kind of this multifaceted, multidisciplinary background.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for being here with us today. I mean, for me, I've known you. I can't even remember when I first met you now. It was long, long time ago. But Matt and I have been running around the same circles for close to a decade, I would say, and talking APIs, telling stories. I mean, I think we've including Capital One, we've been on the same stage many a times. He was a staple of API Strategy and Practice Conference, excuse me, that I ran for a number of years. And my meeting right before this, I just found out I'm going to be helping lead API Specifications Conference, which is what API Strat became now that it got put into the Linux Foundation. So I'm back at it again. I couldn't keep away. But anyways, stoked to have you here, my friend. Always good to see you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Maybe at the new ASC, we can do it Between Two Ferns, get that set up on stage.
All right. I'm writing a sticky note.
So Matt, Matt and Matthew, what do you prefer?
I answer to both, and I've certainly answered to much worse in my life, but I prefer Matthew.
Okay, Matthew. I was really excited to get into this with you today. One of the roles we didn't talk about when you first came on that seems to be really important to you is this digital gardener. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your thinking around gardening and how it relates to APIs.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that the modern software development environment is complex. and probably will continue to get more and more complex as we continue to move on. It's the nature of things. They start out pure and simple, and then nuance becomes important and details are added, and then over time we end up with this complex software environment that no one person can completely encapsulate in their head. Furthermore, we have what's often referred to as emergence within these ecosystems. You have these things that on their own display a certain set of properties, but then when exposed to other things, now all of a sudden new behaviors that weren't present in any single thing now come to the fore. So when we start talking about things like service meshes, when we start talking about things like CI/CD, when we start talking about things like containers, like all of these things have certain properties by themselves. But then when they start rubbing shoulders in large enterprise environments or even mid-sized environments at this point, they start to have this emergence. And I liken it to a garden. A garden is not something that you have in a lab. A garden is not something where you only have one of any one type of thing. A garden is something that is affected by the weather and the other seeds that happen to blow onto it, that's affected by the sunlight, and all of these things create emergence, create new behaviors. And so as a stakeholder in one of these large environments, as a gardener, it's absolutely important that we recognize we can steer where this garden is. We can help it become something that it's more beneficial and healthy, but we don't have rigid control. We don't have lab-like conditions, and we have to be okay with that level of power in the system. We won't have ultimate power or ultimate control over any of this. And trying to direct things like emergence, where we have a clear outcome and we're going to drive there in a straight line, is a fool's errand.
Are you more of a miracle grow gardener, or are you more of a organic gardener, would you say?
That's an interesting metaphor when taken and compared to software. So a little bit of both. It depends on the context. So I grew up, for viewers that may not know, I grew up on a farm. And I grew up the son of parents that were very progressive with new techniques and new technology. I remember the farmers magazines on the TV stand at home, and they were like advocating solar power back in like the 70s. New technique. And that included things like genetically modified crops. And I saw how those progressive scientific ideals back in the 70s and 80s could help grow crops in arid regions where previously you couldn't do that. The Green Revolution is something that is well known to many agricultural practitioners as being a scientific marvel, like the way that we were able to feed billions and billions of people when it seemed like we had kind of maxed out our output. At the same time, fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, we do see some of the problems of some of that industrialized scale, some of that industrialized processing. So am I dyed in the wool GMO type person? No. Am I a hardcore vegan, free range advocate? Well, no. It's a mix and match. Very pragmatic approach.
I cage up a lot of my APIs. You really gotta cage them up. Like them roaming around all the time in the yard is.
Hey, USDA certified free range APIs are fantastic. They're just really expensive.
The more you use them, the more pipes AWS allocates for them, sort of like a muscle getting stronger.
And you can also get them at Whole Foods. So
exactly, yeah, like exactly. Yep. There's a lot of APIs at Whole Foods. So I'm curious because I find this same kind of like parallelism in pretty much everything humans are doing right now. And the farming one is like really interesting. So there's trade-offs in using GMO crops. There's trade-offs in different kinds of agricultural processes. You probably know them better than I do. But it's really curious how, like, I think a lot of people right now in like the tech world feel like we may even be a little stuck, and it's gonna, like, what is that next step we're gonna take? And it's cool to look back at this whole population bomb. We're never gonna be able to feed more than 1 billion people, and then realize, yes, like we did find a way through that. And I'm curious kind of what parallels you see there.
Sure. Well, I remember growing up, and maybe it was just the location where I was at, but there was like 2 kinds of apples. You had the green one and you had the red one. You had the Granny Smith and you had the Red Delicious, right? And then over time, a lot of really smart individuals were looking at that and figuring out, like, okay, maybe we can force natural selection here. Maybe we can tweak things. And now you go to the apple aisle and you have your Honey Crisps and your, I forget the name of it, but
I'm just
like
happy
literally dozens and dozens
first.
and dozens. What's that?
I'm just happy you said my favorite one first. Like, you could have gone to any 20 and you said mine first. So that made me feel good.
Honey Crisps are awesome. Yeah, it's amazing the diversity that we now have in that grocery store aisle. And really that's all some very purposeful decision making on natural processes that create these things. And in the same way, when we talk about APIs, we're not really only talking about REST-ish APIs anymore. We're talking about things like GraphQL and gRPC and WebSockets and so on and so on and so on. Like, the diversity of what we have on our quote unquote store shelf that we can choose to help solve our problems right now is fascinating, and it's awesome. And it's the result of some very specific decisions that have made to tailor and tweak these things. However, like, you also need to know, like, how these things will work for your dish that you're trying to make up. Like, are you going to grab that GraphQL API and insert it into your dish that calls for a different paradigm? Like, you need to understand the how and the why of these things.
I think the diversity aspect. I think a lot of people, I wouldn't say fear, aren't always into API diversity. So I'm not going to go down the other diversity road as part of this in tech right now. But API diversity, I think people want, they want to be shown and told a certain way and have one crop and, like, all right, here, just give me the prescription for how I do this. Give me the seeds. Give me the whole process, how I grow it, and then I'll harvest and move on. I don't want to have to think about the bigger picture of how my crop fits in. But then you start having, have you seen where teams, their crops affect each other, and the the GMO blows in from the farm next to it, into the organic vegan, power team, have you seen that happen?
Yeah, well, I've even had this happen on my own team. So I'm the director for the API Center of Excellence at Capital One. And so as such, I run a team. And there was a sentiment among one of my team members like, can't we just stick to this particular approach? Like, it would be so much simpler if rather than having to account for these different approaches and these different tools and technology and keep up with the thought leaders across the entire industry, can we just, like, freeze this in time and only focus on supporting this element? And that's when I really started to look around at different practices, different disciplines. And that's when I came across the pace layer theory by Stuart Brand. And he didn't develop it whole cloth. The pace layering theory is actually something from proper architecture, like building architecture, that was around shearing layers. And just briefly for the audience sake, what this is it's acknowledging that different things move at different speeds, and that at the fastest moving, you have fashion. The things come in and out of fashion almost on a quarterly basis. In the API space, I would almost attribute this to, for example, when Netflix drops a brand new blog post. It's like, oh my gosh, what is the leader doing? We have to copy the leader. Like, that's almost a fashion of how we practice. After fashion, there's commerce. Like, there's a commerce layer. Once we see popular things within the fashion layer. Now we want to start making some money off of it. You start having companies spun up to take advantage of this and sell that service or sell that product. After commerce, you have infrastructure. After infrastructure, you have governance. After governance, you have culture. And after culture, you have nature. And I see a picture of that up on the screen. The idea being, the further down in these layers that you go, the slower the layer changes. And this is actually good. When you jump down to that bottommost layer, that nature layer, you wouldn't want the speed of light changing. It would be very hard to develop electronic systems if the speed of light was constantly changing. But at the same time, you need the energy and the excitement and the enthusiasm of the fashion layer on top. This is what keeps people's attention. This is what drives sales of enterprise software, billboards and airports. I mean, it's what's very important. So these layers are all necessary. So to bring this back to your question, I had this person on my team saying, I really wish we could just standardize. We could just make everything so it was the same and we didn't have to account for this fashion. And I said, but the fashion is absolutely vital. Occasionally, something comes out of fashion that is a revolution. And that it's so profound that it goes from fashion to commerce to infrastructure. It comes down through these layers and becomes the new way that we will do things. Think about like cloud infrastructure. If you go back 15 years, people didn't know what that was. People had server closets. People had data centers. They didn't pay Amazon to do their compute. And so, Amazon looked at what they were doing and they said, hey, we've got an incredible paradigm for scale. I bet other companies might want to take advantage of this too. And so it very quickly went from fashion to commerce to other companies' infrastructure to something that required governance. So a lot of companies had to spin up rules around when you can use Amazon, when you shouldn't, what kind of data you put on Amazon, what kind of data you need to keep in-house, so on and so forth. It's like, so cloud infrastructure was one of these really powerful ideas, started out as fashion and has now become, I would argue, the culture at many leading technology companies. And so when I pointed this out to this member on my team, suddenly, rather than being burdensome, rather than being like, I got to deal with the hype and the noise, suddenly it became, it's just at a different layer. It's very valuable. This is its place in how we relate to each other. And now I'm much more intrigued in seeing what comes out of fashion that may impact these subsequent layers.
Yeah, I think one thing that has always rung true in my mind is the more like mental models you have around these kinds of things, the easier it is to kind of make sense of the world and decide what to do next. And yeah, it's like the fountain of the internet talking about all the new paradigms and other things to learn. Like, it seems endless. But I really enjoy like this model as a way to kind of break it down. And it occurs to me that the sort of requirements to transition from one phase to the next, they kind of are very like timely, and they're different depending on what the problem is. But there's some like threshold. Like, it's not just some things go down, like something about the solution or the state of the world or something makes it so like it can jump that threshold. And for Amazon in the beginning with cloud, it may have just been that they had all this extra capacity they had built up for the holiday season, and they could sell it at a cost that was cheaper than doing it yourself. And we're one of the first people to do that, and then could use those economies of scale to make it even grander and grander and grander. But I don't think it was obvious to people that cloud would be cheaper until some of those economic, circumstances just happened to line up just right to make it sort of inevitable that would start to sink down through these layers.
Right. And I'll be quick to point out, like, oftentimes that transition between layers is not smooth. Like, usually it's rather volatile as the sides begin to juxtapose and shadow box each other. Like, you'll have fights between the old guard and the new guard. And it's like, okay, well, rather than positioning this battle as versus, old versus new, if you adopt a model like this, where you recognize this is the natural progression of things, then the next step is to set up meaningful forums to have the discussion, to have the debate, so that you recognize, yes, we will have stuff coming into the company that will be brand new. It will be fashion, but rather than dismissing it as, you know, the latest fad or the latest bit of noise or the latest bit of hyperbole, like, let's set up the necessary coordination mechanisms to evaluate this kind of stuff, not to just accept it without questioning, but to acknowledge its place in our technology journey.
And I wonder the role of government. I mean, I know governance, you know, could be easily there, but what's the role of government in some of this evolution back and forth and making things happen, you know, with regulatory and rule making, or then responding to, you know, I would say they're very much responding to Facebook having kind of traverse some of these layers, you know, and as from our cultural and societal, like Facebook was definitely in fashion and in the area for a while, but then traversed and became such part of our fabric. You know, now the government's just like having to respond to this, and they really don't know how to think through any of this any better than I think sometimes the enterprise leadership does. So it's an interesting spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. An example that I really enjoy using is around ride sharing. Mm-hmm. You know, people have been picking other people up from the airports for about as long as there have been airports and automobiles. Like that's always existed. But then you had companies like Uber and Lyft come along, and they suddenly had scale, and suddenly this fashionable thing was generating a lot of commerce. And so then you started to have your places like airports have to have dedicated ride sharing pickup spots, because this was now part of the infrastructure. It was so popular that just having drivers weave in and out of your normal pickup drop-off area was problematic. Meanwhile, you had places like Austin that said, oh, we're actually not happy with some of these practices that these companies do. We're going to take this to the governance layer and say what we will and will not allow these ride-sharing companies do in Austin. And if you've been to Austin, maybe in the before times, you know that they have their own ride-sharing companies because there's specific limitations on Uber and Lyft. So that's an example of how this stuff can very quickly go down through the layers, because there was something about the ease and the desirability of that experience that quickly moved it from fashion into where it's now rubbing up against the governance and culture issues. Facebook, I think, is very interesting. We'll have to see what shakes out. Clearly, Facebook has gotten to such a size, you could argue that it probably deserves some kind of governance, and it probably affects culture. Mm-hmm. But what that looks like, that's part of that messy moving in between layers that I was referring to. It's not a straight shot down through the layers and suddenly it's placed where it's supposed to be. There will be give and take, and we'll probably see some stabs at what governance looks like that probably need to be tweaked.
As someone like building tools and developer tools, like specifically, what's interesting to me is that a lot of things that are built sort of have to have that fashion component to get recognition, to get usage in the beginning. But I feel like the ones that end up being durable have sort of this infrastructure edge to it that might not be apparent to everyone on day one, but has definitely been like deliberately added. And I'm curious kind of, you know, from, you're talking about it very much from like the company that's consuming this noise from the outside in and making changes internally. What is your sort of thinking about how people actually can create new infrastructure or solve some of these deeper problems and use this model to help them think through some of those opportunities and some of like the considerations that might seem like, oh, I'll deal with that in a year, but you should actually deal with it now in the beginning as part of the plan.
Right. I think it's absolutely important to build safe spaces to allow people to experiment and try things out. So, you know, in the particular case of Capital One, yes, we may be a primarily REST-ish shop, but we still allow for experimentation that then we keep very close tabs on. We keep an eye on, because if that experiment with gRPC shows that we can solve things better, faster, cheaper, more than what we previously did, that's something that we want to take and expand out and use our centrality in the organization to drive positive change through the rest of the organization. On the flip side, if we have that safe space, that experimentation space, and we see it and we start thinking that it looks like an invasive weed, then we say, no, time out. No, we're not going to allow this, because if we allow this to proliferate, we're going to have dandelions all over our front yard. And that's not what we want to have happen. So it's not enough to just read the blogs or follow the newsletters. You have to create the safe spaces within your organization to allow for fashion to play out. But if at some point you see that fashion is powerful, if it's revolutionary, if it's beginning to become part of people's infrastructure or even their culture, like this is my day-to-day way of getting work done, you have to acknowledge that and then think about how you healthily introduce that to the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah, it reminds me of the idea that hasn't quite played out the way people hoped it would, the laboratories of democracy thing of federalism. Like there's all these different areas where we can do this experimentation. And I hear this safe space idea and I'm like, oh, this is a laboratory of democracy to try things, to keep it contained if it doesn't work the way we expect, so we can sort of revert back to what was working before, but also to find like the good ideas, elevate them, give them enough oxygen to sort of prove themselves, and then take that and sort of spread the good message around.
So I'm playing with a few captions here, just, so I got API dandelions and then now I think some things like API bell bottoms, things that used to be fashionable but aren't, like how do we keep applying this to the API space? I think I think people they forget about the culture and the people and the nature in all of this tech. I think you expect, you get isolated in the tech world as a tech person, and everything's kind of just on this fast track. And so you forget about the human beings, you forget about the things. And it's easy to get caught up in like this, oh, it's just inevitable, these things are going to happen. And you're just on one of these layers and you forget that actually gravity affects APIs, physics, like there are natural things and cultural things that are going to guide us. And I'd be curious from a center of excellence, what is success? What is excellence in a center of excellence? Is it API excellence, or is it more of a human excellence, to make sure this works for all the people?
Ability to accommodate change.
Yeah.
I think all too often when you have a new initiative or a new program, there's a destination in mind. Like once we achieve this state, we are good, and everybody switches and moves to something else. And that's where, for something like APIs, people get into trouble, because this will continue to be an area that will evolve, that will change, that will mature in some areas, but will need constant reevaluation and re-energization. I just made up a word. Re-energizing. So if you set out with a specific destination in mind, not only are you going to be disappointed because you're never going to get there, things are constantly changing, but you're also going to narrow your focus. You're going to put blinders on because you're going to have a preconceived notion of how you are going to progress through this landscape. So it's absolutely vital that we reframe that conversation. And if, as a API center of excellence, we can accommodate change, we have the processes, we have the forums, we have the communication strategy, we have the means, and we have the reporting by which we can evaluate new things, create virtuous feedback loops where we are getting constant signals from our stakeholders and our developer teams and our consumers. And then we're able to use that as a motivating mechanism to then get us to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing safely, carefully, that is success for us.
Yeah, I love that model because my personal belief around these things is that it's all about the evolvability of the system, like, and the way that software plays a role in the company. At the end of the day, it's not just the tech; it's the company that's doing something in the real world that has to be done well and has to be done better than the competition and all these other components. But the way I've always seen software playing into that is it's the thing that underpins our rate of learning and evolution. And if systems are hard to evolve and systems are hard to change, and new learnings that could make our business better if we bring them in from the outside can't get introduced, then it slows down like our whole rate of evolution, and we'll be the apple that didn't quite make it onto the store shelf because we didn't change fast enough or get where we had to go.
Within constraint. It is a balancing act. And the story that I often tell there is about when you leave your house and get into a vehicle. There are constraints that we all accept when we're on the road, whether that's a speed limit or the side of the road that we're driving on, or, a stop sign. There are constraints that we have accepted as a culture because it allows the greatest number of people to go to the most number of places safely. If you only have the frame of reference of a single developer team or of a single driver, I'm going to floor it. I'm going to ignore every rule. I'm going to get myself from A to B the fastest. And that can't happen within a large organization. So yes, innovation and change is very exciting, but it needs to be balanced with the safety of everybody, because these are shared roads that we're traveling. These are shared spaces. So how do we manage that? How do we allow the flexibility to allow people to go from A to B, but at the same time get the people going from B to C and D to E and whatever? How help them to also travel these same spaces?
Yeah, there's a good game theory Nash
Just
equilibrium.
change for change's sake
Yeah,
is just as bad as we're not allowing for any change.
Yeah, I definitely am with you on that. And I think the road metaphor is a really something that I can like put my brain on immediately and be like, oh yeah, I would want the other people to be considerate of where I am driving. It's a great metaphor.
Oh, I think I lost you.
Uh-oh.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, so you can hear me. I can't hear you.
Uh-oh. I hope when I screen shared, I didn't do anything to you.
That should be fine.
Can you hear us?
Now?
I'm not sure what to tell you, Jen.
Uh-oh.
Lost you.
I just clicked them on off. Can you hear us now? No?
We don't want too much change, just the right amount of change.
Okay, so he's muted there. How about now?
Okay, so my mic is unmuted, but I can't hear you.
I'm gonna click on, say something to him in the private chat.
No, I still can't.
Oh, there you are.
All right, I've pulled my headset, but it's I'm not even getting the static. It's like the window has stopped broadcasting any audio.
Interesting.
Huh.
All right, refreshing.
If it works.
The refresh. It was my printer died yesterday. My daughter needs to print stuff for her university, and I looked up the error. It's like a print head error, and it's like the official support ticket's like, "We'll try unplugging it. Try clicking on and off." And it was like going through all those things. All right.
Do you know the term percussive maintenance?
Yes. Just how about now?
It works. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Nothing.
No. Oh man, what a bummer.
Yeah, it is not. No audio.
I don't know what to do.
Maybe a reboot.
That sucks. Oh
Yeah,
man, now we're gonna have to. I mean, we're getting close to the end, but we still have.
we have some editing here. Seems like it's a one-sided audio thing. It is
Yeah.
funny that we're talking about breaking things before this happened.
He's gonna try the old.
There we go. Now I hear
Hello.
you.
Yeah, really?
I needed bigger headphones so I could hear you better.
Just all the big ideas. Yeah, we were joking about how things have been. We're talking about how it's some kind of change for change's sake is dangerous, and then the audio went out, and clearly something somewhere in this system changed that shouldn't have.
Someday we'll have audio interfaces, video interfaces that will just work, but not yet.
Why don't we have common interfaces that just work in that area? It seems like we would have solved that by now. Technically, I mean, it's easy, right? What were we talking about? I totally got thrown for a loop.
Rate of change metaphors about roads and how we have to not change for change's sake.
Yeah, allowing for change, but it's necessary to have a balance, because just throwing the baby out the window is probably throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or some horrible metaphor, something like that. Mm-hmm. That's where we were.
I remember as a kid, we used to go down to Mexico. My parents weren't big on Thanksgiving and on holidays, so they would take us out around Thanksgiving. We'd drive to Cabo San Lucas and stay until January and come back and go to school. And I remember having to learn the roads. I was about the time I was learning to drive. I did some driving down there. I was only like 12, 13. But you're supposed to look when you're approaching a bridge and read not the signs, because there are no signs that help you in any way. You're supposed to, if there's a steady groove of tracks going down into the ditch on the side of the road, because that means the bridge is out and you've got to go down and go alongside the road. And the one time my aunt was driving and she didn't know the signs, and we just launched off and there was no bridge there. And so I'm always like thinking about roads. Like, I mean, we were asleep in the back and it was like rude awakening, like boom, jumped off and like it rolled a couple times and we're all okay. But like I became hyper aware of how many affordances and how we just take our infrastructure for granted here in the United States, because our bridges work for the most part. But I wonder about this with internet technology and as infrastructure. And I've tried over the years to try to get people to think about internet technology in terms of transit, public transit, and road systems. But people don't seem to like to do that. And I haven't fully figured out why. But
can we talk about NFTs?
Yes.
In relation to web infrastructure?
We can.
So anybody that follows me on Twitter probably knows that I've had a bit of a burr under my saddle when it comes to NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. Mm-hmm. In theory, it allows a digital artist who doesn't have a whole lot of avenues for monetization to put something on a blockchain and sell the ownership of that. So there's some metadata that is, this is the digital asset, and then this is the owner. You put those two things together, you put it on the blockchain, and it's non-fungible, meaning you can't change it. If you own it, you own it. And then if down the road that investor wants to resell that art to someone else, then they put a new sale on the blockchain, and so on and so forth. So in theory, it sounds really great, but in practice, it goes back to that internet infrastructure that you're talking about. That thing, that image is actually not the thing that's put on the blockchain, because sometimes these are animated GIFs, sometimes these are movies. They're very big, and it would be computationally expensive to then compute the hashes on these things when you're putting them on the blockchain. So instead, people are taking that owner information and hashing it with a link.
The QR code, like a QR code kind of?
No, just a link. Just a
Just a
link.
link.
Now
No.
think about the web for the past 20 years and the number of places that have gone out of business, that are now returning 404s. I mean, I still read RSS feeds, and I can tell you those things are not permanent. Those links disappear. And so you have people paying vast amounts of money to put ownership to a specific link for something that we have historical precedents changes. It's like, there's a variety of other reasons why it really gets my goat, but colorful annoyances aside, like that's to your point. Like, we have infrastructure, and we just assume that infrastructure, we treat it like nature. Like, this is a law of nature. This link will never change. Kind of like the speed of light. This link is permanent. It's there forever. But it's not. It's at the infrastructure layer. It's not at the natural layer. And so we have the wrong model when it comes to how we're associating with these things.
Yeah. Well, first thing I'll say, if you want to pay me $10 million to put a link on my GitHub, I will. Just throwing it out there. That's an open offer to anyone who's listening. And secondly, I think that's actually really, we've been thinking about like sort of how things move down, but also I think it's a good point that sometimes when we think of something at the wrong level, it can lead us to have all these different biases about it that aren't necessarily correct. And yeah, also, as I'm not sure if the speed of light is constant, I might be on the outside fringy with papers I read, but that might change over time, just very, very slowly. And I think yeah, when we look down and we see these things that are infrastructure, like, who knows, maybe even the cloud computing primitives will be different in the future. And we need to be like able to accommodate all of that in the model. But at least, even if we can't react to the change as well as we like, we should at least be able to like step back once a week and look at it all and like see it as it is and where everything is on the stack.
Right. So I'll acknowledge the speed of light thing, like, hat tip. For most people in the audience, I think probably like Newtonian physics, it's just assumed that that's a thing,
yeah.
that's a constant.
That could be the governance part of our conversation, is we assume Newtonian physics for all layers above.
I can't tell you how disappointed I was in college when I was like, I've done all this work and this is hokey. Like it works on our planet, but not really. That's not really the model. It's like, oh man.
The infrastructure part about, I have a script that I run on my blog, and I just switched my blog, apievangelist.com, back to running on GitHub. I had all these I ran it on GitHub for the last 6 or 7 years, and I just switched it back to my own infrastructure because I was going to do a bunch of things that I didn't do. And so I moved it back to GitHub because it's easier for me to maintain there, and the community can submit pull requests to help me maintain it. And part of that process is that I make sure all of my links work. The ones that I care about, the ones I don't care about, I let go away. But then I run a script on all of my blog posts, and all the links in my blog post checks for 200s or 404 status codes on each of them. And I'm always amazed at how much goes away. And what do? I just stop link, even though I say, here, click here for more information. I can't leave that link and just let them go there. So what do? I used to take screenshots of every link, and then if something went away, I would just mouse over and do the screenshot. But I almost don't even care at that level. And I just worry about us that in this state, I mean, even like Twitter gave access to the Library of Congress to archive all of, here's the archive for Twitter. And they couldn't make it work with all the links and that's only the last 15 years of a slice of the internet pie. So we seem to be just assuming this we live in this, it's a constant, it's a given. This is going to it's infrastructure. It's going to be there. These URLs are going to work forever, and they don't. And I just worry about us as a society, as a species.
If somebody wants a free business idea, I'll hand one out here because I've been way too busy to do it. But I write a newsletter, and so I know that pain that you're talking about with broken links. I recently celebrated the 5th anniversary of my Net API notes, and as a result, I went back through and I started looking at some of those seminal articles and finding that a number of them are just gone.
Yeah.
And so if somebody wants to create a business, what you do is you go and you work with like your Substacks or your Tiny Letters, and you offer a service, a value-added service, where you will scan an email newsletter and you'll find all the links. And what you'll do is you'll submit those links to the Internet Archive, which, by the way, I'm also a paying member. And if you have some extra money, they certainly could use your help. But you submit those links to the Internet Archive, and then you return that newsletter, not with the original links, but with the links to the Internet Archived versions. So that as a newsletter provider, I know that that will be, if not evergreen, at least pretty close. And that those foundational stories that are being told will be preserved. Like if it's good enough to be included in my newsletter, it's because I've done some kind of value judgment. I've felt like this is really important. I don't talk about everything. I talk about the things that I find very important. And it makes me sad when that stuff goes away, because that's foundational. That's how we got here. Those are the stories that have made the industry what it is today. So I would love it if somebody would build that. I started down that road, and then I've gotten busy. I'll probably be busy for the foreseeable future. But if there is anything out there that does that, please let me know.
So this sounds like a time for me to talk about, did you know that Aiden works for, his startup is the StoryCore for APIs? So the NPR StoryCore, and I'm not going to explain it this time. Anyways, I say this like every couple episodes, and sometimes I explain myself and sometimes I don't. And I'm not going to explain myself this time. I'm just going to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to be too promotional during these, but we do record basically every API change that ever happened. So you can go back in time and understand, why did this API of ours change in this specific way? Not nearly as cool as the automated Internet Archive idea, which I love and I want to be a part of at some point. But I think telling these stories over time is really important. And like so often, to your point in the beginning about like looking at things with its layers, like we need to preserve the history of all these things to be able to have good conversations about them and learn from our past and go into our future. And I think doing that for APIs, doing it for the seminal stories to help us talk about APIs and technology, all this is like important, and it often gets lost because of fashion and Twitter and news feeds organizing by what was said last, not necessarily what was said that's important to what you're dealing with right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's trying to figure out how, oh shoot, I lost my screen. Hold on, I got to find my restream. Sorry. Oh no, too many tabs.
You putting another caption on?
No, I'm gonna.
At this point,
I was gonna share an actual story. Crap, where did my restream go?
He's the Chiron evangelist.
Exactly. Speaking of newsletters, actually, I got to tweet this out. I was just looking as I'm looking for my screen here. Let me just look at my thing. Restream. There it is. All right. I'm going to share my screen, but I heard in another call. So speaking of API newsletters, so Matthew's newsletter is one of the top 2 API newsletters. The other is James Higginbotham and Keith Casey have one. And there's a phrase coined in the OAI, Open API Initiative marketing meeting today, called Higginbotham baiting. How do you get them to write about you? And so now I'm guessing there's a Reinbold baiting. I got to come up with a Reinbold baiting. How do you get Matt to write about you in his newsletter? I got to work on that. Anyways, side note, what I was actually looking to share is this is an example of API preservation that I do, because I'm a collector of APIs. And this is the original Twitter. This is at Twitter field guide, APIevangelist.com, because it no longer exists. But this is the old Twitter API documentation that looked like a field guide. And you can look through it. It looks like an Audubon field guide. And I forget when it went away, but I kept a copy of it. And so when it comes to the story core of APIs, like, how do we keep these stories and preserve them from I think the open API or the machine readable is interesting to me, but also the overall DX and experience that people had as part of it. I think this is an interesting one for that.
Right. And it's one piece too, because for those that are familiar with the Twitter API, there was an exciting initial momentum behind how you could use Twitter and how people were incorporating it. It was all tied up into the social web or Web 2.0, and things were flying fast and furious. And then over time, there was so much about the storytelling where developers were having bad experiences because Twitter slowly, as part of their strategic decision making, started pulling back on the feature sets and what was offered. And now we're not so concerned with third-party developers, or we're not concerned with people that might be producing something to compete with us, or that might strip ads out of the feed. So we're contracting, and now we're to the point where the story has changed again. Like now they're very pro developer. They're back out. They're trying to win back some of that favor, some of that intent, and reignite some of that developer enthusiasm. So, artifacts like this are part of the story, but it's only one part. I think being able to capture the entirety of that journey is really important for new API developers who might be looking at Twitter and only seeing it at face value.
Yeah, there's a lot there to have. I think here's another one that I don't have packaged up for exploration as much. I have collected it. I have the HTML. I just got to make it so it's browsable. But this is the API that Facebook deprecated, and you won't find it on their changelog for deprecation. But this is the API that say there's an election and you want to automate the targeting of people who believe a certain way about certain races and groups of people, and you want to influence them to vote a certain way. This is the API, how you automate that and scale that to and so these types of API deprecations, I think culturally there's a lot of them that are out there. They come and then they go, and how they influenced us. I mean, this one still captures my imagination. I think about this often, how I could distill something technical down to something that's so beautiful and easy to understand and relatable. I just think we just assume things are going to last too long, and they aren't, and they're going to die and wither and go away. So anyways, I got a little bit of political there for you. I apologize. Go ahead, Aiden.
I was going to say, as we get close to the end of our time, maybe we switch gears towards what is going to stick around for a while. What are the durable things? Probably has nothing to do with technology, but what are the things in this space that are good and are going to stick around?
Legos.
I do have a lot of Lego. They're off screen at the moment. So speaking of shearing layers and how we treat our space, setting this up for this interview was important to get everything framed correctly. But I was having an interesting conversation with an executive not that long ago where they're not a technology person. And so they view technology as just the program to be rolled out. And so they asked me the question like, well, aren't we done with APIs? What's the next thing? And I had to restrain myself. I mean, it broke my brain a little bit because as we continue to see new efforts, new initiatives, new technologies, new frameworks, guaranteed they're going to have an API. It might not be the REST-ish API that we're all familiar with. There might be other ways of interacting, but the concept of APIs where you are abstracting technical complexity behind an interface to allow consumers to get the stuff done they need to get done, that's not going anywhere. Like complexity in our organizations is neither created nor destroyed. It's simply pushed off behind various interfaces. So APIs are going to be with us for quite some time. They will be absolutely instrumental in how we continue to produce software despite the fact that it's incredibly complex. That said, we also have to remember people. Like, this notion that we'll get to these perfect machine computable definitions that can be assembled by the Borg and create like this greater consciousness, like developers will no longer have to worry about programming. Yeah, that might as well be some of the science fiction like in the books behind me. That's not going to happen. So as long as we have humans in the loop, we have to design with intent. We have to design with empathy. We have to think about people's experiences. And that connotes a lot of skill sets that people need to have. It's not just push a button and out pops an API and I'm done for the day. It means that we have to get better at dealing with people, meeting people's needs, and being empathetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the more interesting things that someone shared with me is sort of their worldview of what an API even is. And someone explained that it's just like how we divide labor. It's how we let people work on things that they're really good at. And the first generation of these public APIs was like, well, now Stripe is going to be the one that's really good at payment processing, and we don't have to learn that anymore. But internally now, there's teams that are becoming deep stakeholders in different domains, and their customers are other teams internally. And like, that hasn't really been like a front and center part of the world for, in business for a long time. Like, we now have all of these complicated relationships that let us divide our labor up. And I think that is absolutely, to your point, never going to change. It's going to be some interface that's more abstract than the thing that's happening underneath it that let us all talk together and build software together. And that's never going to go away. And this insight that humans are part of that game too, that we have to sort of arbitrate all these different APIs and all these different relationships and be like, there's the machine readable, strict syntax in, strict syntax out type. And then there's sort of this combine it all together type, which is our role in this bigger system. So I think it's like a really cool way to think about it. And I love all the different mental models I now have in my head going into the weekend, thanks to this chat.
I'm still hung up on, wait, I'm never going to be done with this, Matthew. Like, I was totally counting on being done doing this. And I'm just blown away by that. Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for the different mental models. I love the gardening. The gardening one, I think, is super rich with things we could explore. But I think the labor one is another one that we need to have a frank conversation about on this show at some point in the future, is how do we talk about APIs and what it means to labor. I don't think us developers are equipped to have that conversation most of the time. But with that said, we should probably call it quits, because I think we all have jobs we got to get back to. And as much as we'd love to just sit here and chat all day. But thanks, Matthew. Thanks for coming. Any parting words? Any parting words for folks?
Sure. I will be the first one to admit, I don't think any one of us, either on camera or listening to this right now, has all of these issues sussed out. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. If you have something that you heard today that struck a thought, or you wanted to like expand my knowledge on one of these things, certainly go to my website. It's MatthewReinbold.com. You probably got the spelling of my name from whatever show notes or show title you happen to see here. But if you go to MatthewReinbold.com, you'll find my Twitter, you'll find the NetAPI notes link, or you can send me an email if you're old school like that. And I would love to keep the conversation going, because the feedback from people is part of what is so professionally enriching about doing things like this.
Very nice. Well, thank you for coming. With that said, I'm going to let you go first, and then Aiden and I are going to shut things off, but then you'll go off into the void and we won't see you. We didn't do the backstage thing properly this time. So anyways, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it, and have a good weekend.
This has been great. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you. All righty. Well, that was another good one. Another interesting one, huh?
Yeah, and two more branches we get to go down now. We have to bring some. I think we should bring some like economists on the show at some point and talk about a completely different angle.
Yeah, I'm into the labor, and one of the words we use a lot in the space is API economy, and I think we need to we need to actually unpack that because I don't think it means what we think it means.
Mission for the weekend.
All right.
Have a great one. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thank you, Aiden. I'll let you go. Have a good weekend. I'll talk to you later.
You too.
All right. And let's wrap it up.